The mountains were silent, except for the whisper of pine needles, shifting in the cold morning air. A lone figure stood on the porch of a remote ranger station, surveying the wilderness that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. Then she saw it. A wounded military K-9 collapsed at the edge of her property. The simple act of mercy that followed would change everything. By dawn, 20 wild dogs surrounded her cabin, and Ranger Morgan Reed would discover that compassion creates bonds stronger than blood, and that sometimes salvation comes with teeth and fur. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Morgan Reed stood on the weathered porch of Blackridge Ranger Station, watching the first pink fingers of dawn stretch across the jagged mountain horizon. 3 months into her posting at the most isolated station in Clearwater National Forest, and she still hadn't grown accustomed to the silence. It pressed against her eardrums like a physical force, punctuated only by the distant cry of a hawk and the soft creaking of the old cabin's timber frame. She wrapped her hands around a steaming mug of coffee, the real kind, not the instant stuff she'd grown accustomed to during her tours in Afghanistan. The Forest Service didn't pay much, but the perks included all the solitude a person could, wanting coffee that didn't taste like burnt rubber. Morgan took a sip, letting the bitter warmth spread through her chest. At 34, she'd traded in her military uniform for the olive green of the Forest Service, exchanging battlefields for forestlands. Some days, she wasn't entirely sure which was more dangerous. The radio inside crackled to life, breaking the morning stillness. Morgan sighed and ducked back through the door, setting her mug down on the cluttered desk that dominated the cabins. Main room, Blackridge Station, this is dispatch, over. The voice belonged to Tim Holcomb, the ranger coordinator whose voice was often the only human contact Morgan had for days at a stretch. She picked up the receiver. This is Blackridge. Go ahead. Morning, Reed. Just checking in. Weather system. Moving in from the northwest. Expect heavy precipitation starting tonight. Possible flash flooding in the low areas. How's your supply situation? Morgan glanced toward the storage room. Good for 2 weeks. Maybe 3 if I ration. Smart. Road might wash out if this hits as hard as they're predicting. Might want to secure anything that could blow away. Copy that, Morgan replied, mentally cataloging the equipment scattered around the station grounds. Anything else? There was a pause. Then Tim's voice returned, lower this time. Yeah. Got reports of increased activity from that militia group, the Freemen. Fish and Game spotted some fresh camps about 15 miles east of you. Morgan felt her jaw tighten. The Cascade Freemen weren't just anti-government survivalists. They were well-armed extremists who considered the national forests their personal territory. They'd been a growing headache for all government agencies in the region, but especially for isolated rangers like Morgan. Lovely, she muttered. Any specific threats? Nothing directed at you, but they've been hassling campers, claiming they're patrolling against forest fires. Just keep your eyes open, okay? And check in daily. Will do. She hung up, her peaceful morning effectively shattered. Morgan gathered her long chestnut hair into a practical ponytail and changed into her uniform. The mirror reflected a face that had grown leaner since she'd taken this posting. High cheekbones more pronounced, the spray of freckles across her nose standing out against sun-bronzed skin. Her eyes, her father had always called them forest eyes for their unusual shade of green, looked back at her with a wariness that hadn't been there before Afghanistan. She strapped on her utility belt with its standard issue gear, multi-tool, radio, first aid kit, bear spray. After a moment's hesitation, she unlocked the small gun safe beside her bed and removed her personal sidearm, a Glock 19 she'd purchased after her second tour. Forest rangers weren't routinely armed, but those in remote outposts had discretion. With the Freemen active, she wasn't taking chances. The morning patrol took Morgan along the eastern ridge, checking campsites and posting notices about the coming storm. Most hikers had already cleared out, sensing the weather change in the feeling of the air, the way experienced outdoors people often could. By noon, she'd reached Eagle Point, the highest accessible outlook in her jurisdiction. Morgan paused there, pulling out her binoculars to survey the vast expanse of forest spreading below her. The pine and spruce created a dark green carpet, occasionally interrupted by meadows or the silver ribbon of Clearwater River winding through the valley. It was beautiful, pristine, and increasingly tense territory as different groups fought over its use and management. She'd chosen this posting precisely because of its isolation. After 10 years in the army, including 3 tours as a combat medic, Morgan had seen enough of humanity's worst instincts. The forest offered simplicity, protect the land, help people enjoy it safely, survive the elements. No politics, no competing agendas. At least that had been the theory. The reality included budget cuts that left her as the sole full-time ranger for nearly 100 square miles, increasing hostility from groups like the Freemen and the personal demons that followed her from Afghanistan, the ones that woke. Her screaming in the night, convinced she was back in a field hospital with dying soldiers under her hands. Morgan recorded the condition of the trail in her logbook, noting areas that would need attention after the storm. As she worked, a movement in the valley below caught her eye. She raised her binoculars again, focusing on a plume of dust rising from a dirt access road rarely used except by Forest Service vehicles. A black SUV with tinted windows was making its way toward the main campground area. Not typical camper transportation, especially not with a storm approaching. Morgan frowned, making a note of the time and location. Probably nothing, but worth checking on her way back. By the time she reached the campground, the SUV was gone, but evidence of visitors remained. Fresh tire tracks, a still warm fire pit that had been improperly extinguished, and trash scattered near a picnic table. Morgan muttered a curse as she knelt to properly extinguish the embers and collect the garbage. Real outdoorsmen, she muttered sarcastically, too important to pack out their own trash. Among the discarded food wrappers and beer cans, something unusual caught her attention, a small metal casing that she immediately recognized as a shell from a high-powered rifle. Morgan picked it up carefully, examining the markings, not standard hunting ammunition, military grade. She pocketed the shell and finished cleaning the site, an uneasy feeling settling between her shoulder blades. Hunters were common enough, though this wasn't hunting season. Target practice wasn't prohibited in certain areas, but military-grade ammunition and black SUVs made an unsettling combination, especially with the Freeman reports. The afternoon brought darker clouds and a sharpening wind that bent the treetops and sent leaves skittering across the forest floor. Morgan quickened her pace on the return journey, wanting to secure the station before the storm hit in earnest. She was less than a mile from Blackridge when she heard it, a low, pained whine coming from the thick underbrush about 20 yards off the trail. Morgan paused, hand instinctively moving to her sidearm. Bears weren't uncommon, though they usually avoided humans. Mountain lions, too, though they rarely vocalized like that. The sound came again, distinctly canine this time, probably a coyote injured in a fight or by a trap. The Freemen were known to set illegal traps on federal land. Caution, warred with compassion as Morgan considered her options. Wildlife management wasn't strictly her jurisdiction, that fell to Fish and Game, but an animal suffering from a trap couldn't wait for bureaucratic boundaries to be sorted out. She drew her sidearm, more as precaution than threat, and moved, carefully toward the sound, pushing aside dense ferns and stepping over fallen logs. The forest was growing darker as the storm clouds thickened overhead, casting everything in premature twilight. "Easy now," she called softly, hoping to alert the animal to her presence without startling it. The underbrush thinned into a small clearing, and Morgan stopped short at what she saw. Not a coyote, not a wolf, a dog, a large one with the distinctive coloring and build of a Belgian Malinois. It lay on its side, breathing heavily, one leg clearly injured and bleeding. Around its neck was a specialized tactical collar with a now silent radio transmitter. Morgan knew immediately what she was looking at. A military working dog, specifically the kind used by special forces and elite police units. She'd worked with similar K9s in Afghanistan. "Hey there, soldier," she said softly, holstering her weapon and approaching with slow, deliberate movements. "What are you doing all the way out here?" The dog's eyes, amber and surprisingly alert despite its condition, locked onto her. It made no aggressive move, but its entire body tensed, muscles coiled beneath its short tan coat. Morgan stopped several feet away and slowly knelt, making herself smaller, less threatening. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." She noticed the blood now, not just on the injured leg, but seeping from what appeared to be a bullet graze along the dog's side. This wasn't an accident or a fall. Someone had shot at this animal. A military working dog, miles from anywhere, with bullet wounds, the black SUV, the shell casing, the Freeman. The pieces were trying to form a picture in Morgan's mind, but it was incomplete, fragments missing. The dog attempted to rise as she edged closer, but collapsed again with a yelp that struck Morgan like a physical blow. These dogs were trained to show no weakness, to work through pain. For this one to vocalize meant serious injury. "Take it easy," she soothed, keeping her voice low and calm. "I'm a medic. Or I was. Let me help you." Whether it was her tone or some animal ability to sense intention, the dog stopped trying to rise. It watched her warily as she edged closer, its breath coming in ragged pants. Morgan reached slowly into her pack and removed her water bottle. The dog's eyes followed every movement. Dehydration would be setting in, especially with blood loss. "Thirsty? Let's start there." She poured some water into her cupped hand and offered it. For a long moment, the dog just stared at her. Then carefully it stretched its neck forward and began to lap at the water in her palm. The simple act felt monumental, a tendril of trust forming between them. "Good. That's good," Morgan murmured. She continued offering water until the dog had drunk its fill. The clouds overhead were now almost black, and distant thunder rumbled across the mountains. They needed shelter before the storm broke. "I need to move you," she told the dog, knowing it couldn't understand her words, but might comprehend her intent. "My cabin's not far. I can treat you there." The real question was how to transport an injured military dog that weighed at least 70 pounds and might react unpredictably to being handled. She had nothing to use as a stretcher, and, even if she did, navigating the forest terrain alone would be nearly impossible. Morgan made a decision. She shrugged out of her Forest Service jacket and laid it on the ground beside the dog. "This is going to hurt, and I'm sorry about that. But we need to get you somewhere safe." With careful movements, she worked her, hands beneath the dog's body, trying to support its injured leg while preparing to lift. The animal tensed but didn't growl or snap, another sign of its extensive training. "On 3, she said, as much to steady herself as the dog. 1, 2, 3. With a surge of effort, Morgan lifted the dog. It was even heavier than she'd estimated, solid muscle beneath its fur. The dog gave a sharp yelp but didn't struggle. Seeming to understand, she was trying to help. The trek back to the ranger station was grueling. Rain began to fall, first as scattered fat drops that pattered through the canopy, then as a steady downpour that quickly soaked them both. The forest floor turned slick with mud and wet leaves, making each step treacherous. Morgan's arms burned, with the strain of carrying the dog, But she pushed forward, driven by the same determination that had kept her going through firefights and field surgeries. By the time Blackridge Station came into view, Morgan was shaking with exertion, her uniform plastered to her body by the relentless rain. The dog had gone frighteningly still in her arms, though she could feel its heartbeat against her chest. Too fast, but steady. She shouldered open the cabin door and carried the dog to the rug before the small wood stove. Gently, she set it down on her spare sleeping bag, which would be easier to clean than her bedding. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Stay with me, soldier," she said, quickly gathering her first aid supplies. Morgan had maintained a combat medic's habit of keeping extensive medical equipment on hand, far more than the standard ranger kit. She wasn't technically supposed to treat anything beyond minor human injuries or stabilize for evacuation, but the nearest veterinarian was over 60 miles away, and no one was getting through these mountains during a storm. The dog watched her with those intelligent amber eyes as she set out supplies: antiseptic, bandages, a suture kit, antibiotics left over from her last tooth infection, a bottle of whiskey she kept for rare visitors. "I need to clean these wounds," she explained, keeping up a steady stream of gentle talk as she worked. "This is going to sting." The leg injury was her first concern. A deep cut that looked like it might have come from a mesh wire fence or similar obstacle. Not a bullet wound, which was a small mercy. The graze along the ribs was definitely from a bullet, though it had only torn through skin and superficial muscle. As Morgan cleaned, stitched, and bandaged, she found herself falling back into the calm, focused state that had served her well in combat hospitals. Outside, the storm raged, wind howling around the cabin's corners and rain lashing at the windows. But inside, her world narrowed to this animal and its needs. The dog remained stoic throughout the treatment, only occasionally tensing or making small sounds of pain. When she finally finished, Morgan sat back on her heels, exhausted but satisfied. The wounds were clean and dressed, antibiotics administered, and the dog had accepted more water and even a few pieces of beef jerky from her emergency rations. "You're one tough customer," she told it, gently stroking its head. The dog closed, its eyes briefly at her touch, the first sign of complete relaxation it had shown. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, Morgan's mind returned to the questions. What was a military K9 doing alone in the national forest? Who had shot at it, and why? She examined the tactical collar more carefully. No identification tags, which was unusual. Most military working dogs had at least minimal ID. The radio transmitter was high-end but damaged, probably in whatever incident had injured the dog. There was nothing else to indicate where it had come from or to whom it belonged. Morgan took several photos with her phone, though she had no signal to send them anywhere. She'd report the situation to her supervisor when she checked in tomorrow, assuming the radio still worked after the storm. For now, there was nothing to do but wait out the weather and monitor her patient. Morgan built up the fire in the wood stove, changed into dry clothes, and settled into her reading chair with a field guide to local wildlife, the book falling open to the section on wild canids out of habit. The irony wasn't lost on her. The dog had drifted into an uneasy sleep, occasionally twitching or whimpering. Morgan watched it, thinking of the K9s she'd known in Afghanistan. Brave, loyal animals that saved countless lives by detecting explosives, tracking insurgents, and protecting their handlers. This one had likely been through combat scenarios she could only imagine. "What happened to your handler?" she asked softly, not expecting an answer. Military working dogs were deeply bonded to their handlers. For this one to be alone meant something had gone very wrong. As if in response to her voice, the dog's eyes opened, It lifted its head slightly, regarding her with that unnerving intelligence. "Don't worry," Morgan assured it. "You're safe here. We'll figure this out." The dog watched her a moment longer, then lowered its head, eyes still fixed on her face, not fully trusting, not completely relaxed, but accepting her presence as non-threatening. It was a start. Outside, the storm reached new heights of fury, wind screaming through the trees and thunder crashing overhead. Inside, woman and dog regarded each other across a divide of species and experience, both survivors, both alone, until chance or fate had brought them together. Morgan had no way of knowing that by helping this single animal, she had set in motion events that would shatter her carefully constructed isolation and force her to confront not only external threats, but the demons she'd carried from Afghanistan. She couldn't know that her simple act of compassion would ripple outward with consequences she couldn't imagine. She knew only that a wounded creature needed her help, and that for the first time in months, the crushing silence of Blackridge Station had been broken by another living presence. For tonight, that was enough. As Morgan finally drifted towards sleep in her chair, lulled by the storm's rhythm and the dog's now steady breathing, her last conscious thought was a question. What would tomorrow bring? She would have her answer at dawn, when 20 pairs of eyes would surround her cabin, and the true nature of her unexpected patient would be revealed. Morgan woke with a start, disoriented to find herself curled in the reading chair rather than her bed. Pale morning light filtered through the cabin windows, casting long rectangles across the wooden floor. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind that peculiar stillness that follows violent weather, a world holding its breath. Then she remembered. The dog. Her eyes snapped to the spot by the wood stove where she'd left her patient. The sleeping bag lay empty, a depression in the fabric, the only evidence the animal had been there at all. A moment of panic seized her, until she spotted the Malinois standing alert by the front window, ears forward, muscles tense despite its injuries. "Hey there," Morgan said softly, stretching stiff muscles as she rose from the chair. "Feeling better this morning?" The dog didn't turn at her voice, but gave a subtle flick of its ears to acknowledge her presence. Its attention remained fixed on something outside the window. Morgan approached cautiously, still respecting the animal's space. Military working dogs were trained for combat situations, and even an injured one could be dangerous if startled or threatened. As she neared, the dog made a low sound in its throat, not quite a growl, but a warning nonetheless. "What is it?" she asked, peering through the glass. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the clearing around the ranger station, glistening with rainwater in the early light. The storm had left debris scattered across the yard, fallen branches, pine needles, leaves plastered to every surface. Beyond the clearing, the forest stood dark and dripping, mist rising between the trees like spectral figures. Then she saw them. Or rather, she saw the eyes first, amber and gold and dark brown, reflecting the morning light from the shadows at the forest's edge. As her vision adjusted, shapes materialized around those eyes. Dogs, at least 20 of them arranged in a loose semicircle around the clearing, watching the cabin with unnerving focus. "What the hell?" Morgan whispered. They weren't wild dogs, at least not entirely. She could make out various breeds and mixes. German shepherds, Rottweilers, what? Looked like some hound crosses, even a few smaller terrier types. All lean, all watchful, all perfectly still except for the occasional ear twitch or shift of weight. The Malinois beside her made that sound again, deeper this time. Morgan's mind raced through possibilities. A pack of abandoned pets gone feral. That happened sometimes in rural areas when people dumped unwanted animals, though rarely in such numbers. Or maybe escapees from a kennel or breeding operation. Whatever they were, their behavior was unlike anything she'd encountered in her years of wilderness experience. Wild canids didn't arrange themselves in disciplined formations or conduct silent surveillance. They didn't organize around a clear purpose. Yet these animals were doing exactly that, behaving with collective intelligence that raised the hairs on the back of her neck, and they had surrounded her cabin. Morgan backed away from the window slowly, mind shifting into tactical assessment mode, a habit from her military days that had never quite left her. The cabin was secure, built to withstand weather and wildlife. All entry points could be locked and barricaded if necessary. She had food for at least 2 weeks, water from a well pump, weapons if it came to that. But what did these animals want? And what was their connection to the injured military dog now standing guard in her living room? As if reading her thoughts, the Malinois turned its head slightly toward her, amber eyes meeting hers with unsettling directness. There was communication in that gaze, intelligence and purpose that went beyond normal animal awareness. "They're here for you, aren't they?" Morgan said quietly. The dog blinked once, then returned its attention to the window. Morgan's radio crackled to life on the desk, making her jump. After a burst of static, Tim's voice came through. "Blackridge. Station, this is dispatch. Morning check-in, over." She moved to the desk, keeping one eye on the window as she picked up the handset. "Dispatch, this is Blackridge. I'm here. Reed, good to hear your voice. How'd you weather the storm?" Morgan hesitated, weighing how much to share. A pack of dogs surrounding her cabin sounded like the beginning of a poor horror novel, not a credible situation report. Cabin's intact. Some debris to clear. Had an unexpected development, though. She paused. "I found an injured military working dog in the forest yesterday. Belgian Malinois, with a tactical collar. Treated its wounds and brought it back to the station." There was a long pause before Tim responded. "A military dog out there? That's odd. Any ID on it?" "Negative. No tags. And the radio transmitter on its collar is damaged." Another pause. "You said military specifically. You sure about that?" "Affirmative. I worked with K9 units in Afghanistan. This is definitely a trained military dog, probably special. Operations based on the equipment." The radio was silent for so long that Morgan thought they'd lost connection. Finally, Tim's voice returned, lower and more cautious than before. "Listen, Reed. There's been some chatter on official channels. 3 days ago, a joint DEA and military operation went bad somewhere in the northern part of the forest. Details are classified, but there were casualties. They've had teams searching a 20-mile radius from the operation site." Morgan felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of operation?" "Can't say over this channel, but it involved the Cascade, Freeman, and something they were moving through the forest." Tim's voice dropped even lower. "Here's the thing. They specifically mentioned a missing K9 unit in the bulletin. High-value asset, they called it. The pieces clicked into place. The black SUV, the military-grade ammunition, the wounded dog. Whatever operation had taken place, it had clearly gone sideways, and somehow this dog had escaped or been sent away by its handler. Tim, there's something else you should know." Morgan took a deep breath. "There are about 20 dogs surrounding my cabin right now, just watching. Arrived sometime during the night." The silence that followed was heavy. "Come again?" Tim finally said. "You heard me. 20 dogs, different breeds, arranged around the clearing, not behaving like normal wild animals." "Jesus, Reed. Are you safe? Do you need extraction?" Morgan looked at the Malinois, still standing sentinel. By the window, then back to the eerily organized canines outside. "Negative on extraction. They're not acting aggressive, just watchful, and I don't think they're normal strays. There's something organized about them." She hesitated before adding, "I think they're connected to this military dog somehow." "It doesn't make any sense," Tim said, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely dismissing the idea. "I know, but neither does finding a Spec Ops K9 with bullet wounds in a national forest." Morgan could almost hear Tim processing this information, weighing protocols against the bizarre reality she was describing. "Okay, here's what we do," he finally said. "I'll contact the task force handling the Operation Fallout. Let them know you've got their dog. They can send a proper team to retrieve it. In the meantime, stay inside, keep all entries secured, and maintain regular radio contact. Check in every 2 hours." "Copy that," Morgan agreed. "And Tim, maybe don't mention the dog pack just yet. Let's see what happens when the retrieval team shows up." "Roger that. First check in at 1,000 hours. Dispatch out." As the radio fell, silent, Morgan turned to find the Malinois watching her, head slightly tilted as if it had been following the conversation. "Looks like your people are coming for you," she told it, "though I'm guessing you already knew that." The dog continued its unnervingly direct stare for a moment, then limped back to the window, clearly favoring its injured leg, but moving with more strength than the night before. Morgan followed, curious about the scene outside. The dog pack had shifted somewhat. Instead of their earlier perfect semicircle, they had spread out, some lying down, others patrolling the perimeter of the clearing in coordinated movements. They maintained their distance from the cabin, but showed no signs of leaving. "It's like they're standing guard," Morgan murmured. "But why? And how did they find you?" The Malinois made a soft, huffing sound that almost seemed like agreement. Morgan shook her head, trying to ground herself in rationality. Dogs didn't organize search parties or security details. They didn't maintain tactical formations. Yet the evidence was right in front of her, defying explanation. She needed more information, and standing at the window speculating wouldn't provide it. Decision made, Morgan moved purposefully around the cabin, gathering what she'd need: binoculars, her sidearm, though she hoped not to use it, water, and high-protein snacks. She pulled on her boots and grabbed a light jacket. The morning was cool after the storm. The Malinois watched her preparations with visible interest, rising when she approached the door. "Easy," she told it. "I'm just going to observe from the porch. You should rest." The dog ignored her suggestion, positioning itself beside her. At the door, body tense and ready despite its injuries. Morgan recognized the stance, the same alert readiness she'd seen in combat dogs preparing to deploy with their handlers. "Fine," she relented, "but take it slow. Those stitches need time." Carefully, she unlocked the door and eased it open, scanning the clearing before stepping onto the covered porch. The Malinois followed, moving with deliberate control to minimize stress on its wounded leg. The morning air was cool and damp, heavy with the scents of wet earth and pine. Birds had resumed their calls after the storm, creating a backdrop of normality that contrasted sharply with the extraordinary scene before her. From the elevated vantage point of the porch, Morgan could see the dog pack more clearly. There were exactly 22 dogs, varying in size, breed, and coloration, but all sharing the same lean, hardened look of animals that had survived significant challenges. Some bore visible scars or old injuries, healed but marking them permanently. At their appearance, the entire pack shifted their attention to the porch. Several rose from resting positions, and those already standing moved subtly closer, not threatening but attentive. Their focus seemed divided between Morgan and the Malinois beside her, as if assessing both. Morgan raised the binoculars, studying the animals more carefully. What she saw confirmed her initial impression. These weren't typical wild dogs or even ordinary strays. Their movements were too coordinated, their positioning too deliberate. And now she noticed something else. Several wore fragments of collars or harnesses, worn and weathered, but suggesting they had once been owned, perhaps even trained. "Who are you?" she whispered, lowering the binoculars. "And what do you want?" As if in response, one dog separated from the group, a large, scarred German Shepherd mix with one ear partially missing. It moved forward with obvious authority, stopping at the edge of the porch steps, exactly at the boundary between forest, territory, and human domain. The Malinois beside Morgan stiffened, a low rumble starting in its chest. Not aggression, she realized, but recognition, acknowledgement of the other dog's status. The German Shepherd looked directly at Morgan, then deliberately shifted its gaze to the Malinois and back again. The message seemed clear even across species barriers. We are here for him. They sent a search party, Morgan said softly. Amazement, overriding disbelief. They actually organized and came looking for you. The Malinois made a single sharp sound, not quite a bark, more a signal, and the German Shepherd responded with a similar vocalization. Then, to Morgan's astonishment, it lowered its front half in what could only be described as a bow before straightening again. This can't be happening, Morgan muttered to herself, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. These animals were communicating, coordinating. They had tracked the Malinois to her cabin and established a perimeter, not to threaten, but to protect. The German Shepherd turned back toward the forest and made another distinctive sound. In response, two smaller dogs emerged from the pack, a border collie mix and what looked like a cattle dog cross. They trotted forward with purpose, carrying something between them. Morgan tensed, hand moving instinctively toward her sidearm, but the Malinois beside her remained calm, even shifting its weight slightly, as if in anticipation. The two dogs stopped at the bottom of the steps, beside their apparent leader. The object they carried became visible. A weathered military-style backpack, mud-stained and torn, but recognizably human equipment. Morgan's breath caught. The implications were staggering. Not only had these dogs tracked their companion to her cabin, but they had recovered equipment, presumably from the failed operation, and brought it with them. This went beyond trained behavior into realms of problem-solving and cooperation she'd never imagined possible in canines. Slowly, careful to make no threatening movements, Morgan descended the steps. The German Shepherd watched her approach without retreating, its dark eyes assessing but not hostile. When she reached the bottom step, she crouched to bring herself closer to the animal's level. "May I?" she asked softly, gesturing toward the backpack. The border collie and cattle dog looked to the German Shepherd, who gave what appeared to be a slight nod. They set down the backpack and backed away, maintaining what felt like a respectful distance. Morgan picked up the backpack, noting its military specifications, high-grade waterproof material, reinforced stitching, specialized compartments. No name tape or unit insignia, which wasn't surprising for a covert operation. She carried it back to the porch, aware of every dog's eyes following her movements. The Malinois leaned forward, sniffing the pack with obvious recognition. Then looked at Morgan with what she could only interpret as expectation. It wanted her to open it. "Okay," she said, unzipping the main compartment carefully. "Let's see what's so important." Inside, she found several items, a first aid kit more advanced than her own, a sophisticated communications device, currently powered down, a sealed waterproof case containing documents, and a small personal effects pouch. Nothing immediately dangerous, but potentially valuable intelligence if this was connected to the operation Tim had mentioned. As she examined the contents, the Malinois grew increasingly agitated, nosing at the personal effects pouch with insistence. Morgan opened it and removed the contents. A folded photograph, a small notebook, and a military ID card. The ID showed a stern-faced man in his mid-30s with the name Capt. David Keller, Special Forces. The photograph, when unfolded, showed the same man kneeling beside the Malinois, both in desert camouflage, with mountains in the background. Afghanistan, Morgan guessed, recognizing the terrain. "Is this your handler?" she asked the dog. "Captain Keller?" The Malinois made a soft whining sound, the first truly vulnerable noise Morgan had heard from it. The sound contained such clear emotional content, loss, loyalty, purpose, that Morgan felt her throat tighten in response. "You're looking for him," she said quietly. "All of you are." The realization hit her with sudden clarity. Whatever had happened during the operation, this dog and its handler had been separated. Maybe Keller had been captured, or perhaps he'd sent his canine partner away for safety when things went bad. Either way, the dog had escaped, been injured in the process, and now appeared to have rallied this extraordinary pack of strays to help search for its human. It defied conventional understanding of animal behavior, yet the evidence was performing coordinated surveillance around her cabin. 22 dogs with apparent purpose and communication centered around a Special Forces K9, carrying what could only be described as a mission. Morgan looked from the ID to the Malinois, seeing it with new understanding. This wasn't just a military working dog, it was one half of a team, acting with the singular focus that such animals were legendary for. And somehow, it had inspired or organized other abandoned and stray dogs to join its cause. The tactical situation had just become exponentially more complex. Tim had said a retrieval team was coming for the dog, military handlers who would take it back to base, effectively, ending its search for Keller. Standard procedure, logical and orderly. But something told Morgan that procedure didn't apply here. Not with 22 determined canines who had clearly demonstrated extraordinary capabilities and single-minded purpose. And not with the sinking feeling in her gut that Captain Keller might still be alive somewhere in these mountains, perhaps injured or captured by the Cascade Freeman. Before she could consider her next move, the Malinois suddenly stiffened, ears forward, body alert. The German Shepherd and all the other dogs showed similar reactions, heads turning toward the forest road that led to the ranger station. Morgan heard it a moment later, the distant sound of vehicles approaching. The retrieval team was coming, hours earlier than expected. Decisions would need to be made, and quickly. Morgan looked at the Malinois, then at the extraordinary pack that had gathered to aid its mission, and finally at the ID and photograph in her hand. In that moment, standing on her porch surrounded by the most improbable allies imaginable, Morgan Reed, former combat medic, isolated forest ranger, woman who had come to the wilderness to escape human complications, made a choice that would irrevocably alter her carefully constructed solitude. "They're coming for you," she told the Malinois. "But I don't think your mission is complete, is it?" The dog's amber eyes met hers with unflinching focus, and in that shared gaze, a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever happened. Next, they were now bound by something deeper than circumstance, a recognition of purpose that transcended the boundaries between human and animal. The vehicles drew closer, and Morgan squared her shoulders, mind already formulating a plan that went against every protocol and regulation in the Forest Service handbook. But some things mattered more than rules. Some loyalties ran deeper than institutional obligations. Captain Keller had not abandoned his K9 partner, the dog had not abandoned its search for him, and Morgan Reed would not abandon either of them, not when she might be their only chance. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, echoing through the forest. Morgan's mind raced through options and contingencies. Standard procedure would be to wait for the retrieval team, hand over the military K9 and the recovered pack, and file her report about the extraordinary pack of dogs. The authorities would handle the rest, but the urgency in the Malinois' posture and the organized vigilance of the Canine Sentinels told a different story, one where procedure might cost a man his life. "We've got about 3 minutes," she told the Malinois, gathering the contents of the backpack and shoving them into her own go-bag. The captain's ID and photograph she tucked into her jacket pocket. Whatever happened next, she needed to keep those close. She quickly added essential supplies: first aid kit, water purification tablets, emergency rations, spare ammunition for her sidearm, and a topographical map of the region. "If we're going to do this, we do it now," she said, more to herself than the dog. The Malinois watched her with those intense amber eyes, understanding evident in its gaze. Morgan slung the pack over her shoulders and moved to the back door of the cabin. The retrieval team would approach from the main access road, but the forest behind the station offered cover, if they could make it past the clearing without being spotted. She paused, looking back at the wounded K9. "Can you run?" As if insulted by the question, the Malinois straightened, weight balanced to minimize strain on its injured leg. "Message received. Don't underestimate me." Morgan nodded and eased open the back door, scanning the area. The dog pack had shifted in response to the approaching vehicles, most moving toward the forest edges for concealment while maintaining their protective formation. The German Shepherd leader was nowhere to be seen. "Now or never," Morgan muttered and stepped outside. They moved swiftly across the open ground behind the cabin, Morgan keeping her pace measured to accommodate the Malinois. "Injury, 20 yards to the tree line, 15, 10. Just as they reached the first stands of pine, Morgan heard vehicles pulling into the clearing at the front of the station. Car doors slammed, male voices called out official identifications. She and the Malinois slipped into the forest depths. As the retrieval team approached her cabin, once under the canopy, Morgan was startled to find the German Shepherd waiting for them, flanked by 3 other dogs, the Border Collie, a rangy Doberman mix, and a medium-sized dog that resembled a Heeler cross. The German Shepherd made a soft huffing sound and turned, clearly expecting them to follow. "Looks like we've got scouts," Morgan told the Malinois, who acknowledged with a subtle ear flick but maintained focus on their path. They moved deeper, into the forest, following animal trails that wound between massive tree trunks and through undergrowth still heavy with rainwater. The 4 lead dogs set a deliberate pace, fast enough to put distance between them and the ranger station, but measured enough for the injured Malinois to maintain. Periodically, Morgan glanced back, half expecting to see pursuit. Instead, she occasionally glimpsed other members of the dog pack, moving parallel to their course or circling back, a coordinated security detail ensuring their escape. The tactical precision was uncanny. These weren't just animals working together by instinct. This was organized movement with clear roles and purpose. The Malinois might be the mission focus, but the German Shepherd was clearly the field commander, directing the others with subtle signals Morgan was only beginning to recognize. After a mile of steady progress, they reached a small stream swollen with storm runoff. The German Shepherd paused, looking expectantly at Morgan. "I get it," she said, understanding the strategy. "Water masks our scent." They waded upstream for several hundred yards, the cold mountain water numbing Morgan's feet even through her boots. The Malinois moved carefully, favoring its injured leg but maintaining steady progress. Its endurance was remarkable given its wounds, a testament to its military training and breeding. When they finally emerged from the stream onto a rocky bank, Morgan took a moment to consult her map and get her bearings. They were heading northeast, deeper into the wilderness, away from established trails and campgrounds. "This is Freemen territory," she said quietly, noting their direction. "Dangerous ground." The Malinois looked at her, then deliberately turned its head in the direction they'd been traveling, gaze unwavering. The message was clear. "This is where we need to go." "Your handler," Morgan said. "You think he's being held there?" The dog made no response, but its intent focus told her everything. Whatever had happened during that failed operation, Captain Keller had either been captured by the Freemen or had gone to ground in their territory, wounded or trapped. Morgan checked her watch. The retrieval team would have discovered her absence by now. Standard procedure would be to secure the area, report the situation, and begin tracking. They'd have resources she lacked: vehicles, communications, manpower. But they'd also have procedures, chains of command, and approval processes. And they'd have no way of understanding what she now knew: that this extraordinary pack of dogs was the key to finding Captain Keller. The authorities would see them as strays, perhaps even as threats to be contained. "We've got maybe a 2-hour head start," she told the Malinois. "We need to make it count." They continued northeast, the terrain growing steadily more rugged. The dog pack maintained their protective formation around them, scouts ranging ahead and flankers keeping watch on both sides. Occasionally, one would disappear into the forest, only to return minutes later as if reporting findings to the German shepherd leader. By midday, the sun had burned away the morning mist, warming the forest and causing steam to rise from the damp ground. Morgan called a brief halt in a sheltered hollow beside a small spring. She needed to check the Malinois' wounds and reassess their situation. The military dog allowed her examination with stoic patience. The leg wound was holding, though signs of stress showed around the sutures. The bullet graze along its side looked clean with no signs of infection. Morgan applied fresh antiseptic and redressed both injuries, conscious of their dwindling medical supplies. "You're doing well, soldier," she told it, offering water from her cupped hand, "but we need to pace ourselves." As the Malinois drank, Morgan studied their canine companions. The pack had established a perimeter around the hollow, with sentries positioned at strategic points. Several were resting, conserving energy, while others shared water from the spring. Their organized behavior continued to astonish her, defying everything she knew about animal behavior. The German shepherd approached, moving with the confident authority she'd noted earlier. Close up, Morgan could see numerous scars across its muscular frame, evidence of a hard life in the wilderness, yet its eyes showed clear intelligence and purpose, not the feral wariness she'd expect from a wild animal. "What are you?" she asked softly. "Where did you all come from?" The German shepherd simply regarded her, then deliberately looked at the Malinois before returning its gaze to Morgan. A thought occurred to her, far-fetched but increasingly plausible given everything she'd witnessed. She pulled out Captain Keller's ID and photograph, holding them where the German shepherd could see. "You know him too, don't you? You're looking for him together." The dog's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a shift in posture, an intensity of focus on the photograph. Recognition. Morgan's mind reeled with implications. Had Captain Keller worked with multiple military dogs? Had he trained civilian animals alongside his canine partner? Or was there something even more extraordinary happening here? Before she could process these questions, one of the sentry dogs, a lean, dark-furred animal with the leggy build of a coonhound, gave a distinctive low bark. Instantly, the entire pack snapped to alertness, including the Malinois, who struggled to its feet despite Morgan's restraining hand. "What is it?" she whispered, straining to hear what had triggered the alarm. Then she caught it, the faint sound of a helicopter, still distant, but approaching. The retrieval team had called in air support. Their head start was evaporating faster than she'd anticipated. "Time to move," Morgan said, quickly repacking her supplies. The German shepherd was already organizing the pack, sending scouts ahead with short, sharp sounds that the others clearly understood. The Malinois pressed close, to Morgan's side, tense and focused, ready despite its injuries. They set off again, moving faster now, despite the challenging terrain. The helicopter sound grew gradually louder, making conversation impossible. Morgan kept low under the tree canopy, though she knew a thermal imaging system would render that precaution useless if they flew directly overhead. Their saving grace came in the form of the weather. Clouds had begun building again to the west. Not the violent storm system of the previous night, but enough to limit visibility and potentially interfere with search operations. Morgan found herself silently thanking whatever mountain gods might be listening for this small mercy. For the next hour, they pushed hard, following a route that seemed deliberately chosen to make tracking difficult, over rock formations where they'd leave no prints, through dense stands of pine where branches would quickly spring back to hide their passage, across small streams that would mask their scent. The helicopter made several passes in their general vicinity, but never directly overhead. The Freeman territory had become a maze of small ravines and ridges, providing cover and making aerial detection more challenging. Still, Morgan knew their advantage was temporary at best. As they crested a steep rise, the German Shepherd suddenly froze, hackles rising. The other dogs responded instantly, dropping low or seeking cover. Morgan followed suit, pulling the Malinois down beside her behind. A fallen log. Through a gap in the trees, she saw what had alarmed them. Less than half a mile ahead, nestled in a natural bowl between ridges, stood a collection of crude structures, cabins and outbuildings arranged around a central clearing. Vehicles were parked haphazardly around the perimeter, including several that matched the black SUV she'd spotted the previous day. "Freeman compound," she whispered to the Malinois. "Your handler is in there somewhere." The dog's focus was absolute, every muscle tense, eyes fixed on the distant buildings. Morgan didn't need further confirmation. She assessed the situation. With her field binoculars, at least 8 structures of varying sizes, multiple vehicles including a large truck with a covered bed, and approximately a dozen men visible moving about the compound. Several carried rifles openly, not hunting weapons, but military-style arms. Guard positions were evident at key points around the perimeter. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a fortified base, and somewhere within it, if the Malinois' behavior was any indication, was Captain David Keller. Morgan chewed her lip, considering options. A direct approach was suicide. Even with the extraordinary pack of dogs at her side, they were grossly outnumbered and outgunned. Waiting for nightfall would give them cover of darkness, but increased risk of the retrieval team catching up. And every hour they delayed was an hour that Keller, if he was injured, went without medical attention. Her deliberation was interrupted by a subtle movement from the German Shepherd, who had positioned itself beside her. The dog inched forward, then looked back at Morgan with clear expectation before repeating the motion. "You want to show me something," she guessed. The German Shepherd moved again, this time with more purpose, staying low, but clearly expecting Morgan and the Malinois to follow. She glanced at the military K9, who seemed to understand the request, rising cautiously to follow its K9 ally. Making sure they remained concealed from the compound below, Morgan followed the German Shepherd along the ridgeline for several hundred yards. The terrain grew increasingly rocky, with massive boulders creating natural fortifications and deep shadows. Eventually, they reached what appeared to be a dead end, a sheer rock face rising 15 feet above them. The German Shepherd approached the rock wall and disappeared. Morgan blinked, momentarily confused, until she realized there must be an opening concealed by shadows and undergrowth. Carefully pushing aside branches, she discovered a narrow fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. "A back door," she murmured appreciatively. The Malinois pressed forward, nosing at the opening with obvious intent. Morgan hesitated, evaluating the risk. Following an animal into an unknown cave system wasn't standard tactical procedure by any measure, but nothing about this situation fell within standard parameters. "All right," she decided. "Lead the way." She switched on her small tactical flashlight and entered the fissure behind the dogs. The narrow passage twisted for about 15 feet before opening into a larger space, a natural cave, perhaps 30 feet across, with a ceiling high enough for Morgan to stand upright. But what caught her attention immediately wasn't the cave itself, but what it contained. Along one wall, organized with military precision, was an array of equipment: backpacks, weapons cases, communications gear, and several containers marked with medical symbols. A sleeping bag was laid out in one corner, a portable lantern beside it. Maps were pinned to a flat section of rock, with routes and locations marked in different colors. This was an operations base, hidden and secure, and it had been recently used. The lantern battery still had power, and a partially consumed MRE sat atop one of the equipment cases. "This is your handler's setup," Morgan said, understanding dawning. "A forward operating base for whatever mission they were running." The Malinois moved directly to the sleeping bag, sniffing it thoroughly before lying down beside it with a soft whine, the most emotionally transparent sound Morgan had heard from the stoic animal. The connection to Captain Keller could not have been more clear. The German shepherd watched from near the entrance, seemingly standing guard while allowing Morgan to investigate. Several other dogs had followed them in, including the border collie, who paced the cave's perimeter with vigilant attention. Morgan approached the maps on the wall, hoping for insight into Keller's mission. They showed the surrounding forest in detailed topographical renderings, with the Freemen compound clearly marked. Several approach routes were highlighted, and a location about 3 miles east of the compound was circled repeatedly. The site of the operation, she guessed. Nearby, a waterproof case contained what appeared to be surveillance photos of the compound and several of its occupants. Morgan recognized one man from briefings she'd received about the Freemen, Victor Blackwell, their leader, a former military contractor with radical anti-government views and a reputation for violence. Another photo showed several men loading large crates into the covered truck she'd spotted at the compound. Handwritten notes beside the photo read, "Confirmed, shipment arriving 5/2, intercept before delivery." Morgan checked the date on her watch. Today was May 4th. Whatever operation had been planned against the Freemen, it had been scheduled to occur 2 days ago, exactly when Tim had reported the mission going bad. The picture was becoming clearer. A joint DEA and military operation to intercept a shipment, weapons, drugs, or both, being moved by the Freemen. Captain Keller and his canine partner had been part of that operation, which had somehow gone sideways. The Malinois had escaped, been injured in the process, and now was leading an improbable rescue mission with the help of what appeared to be an organized pack of forest dogs. It was simultaneously the most bizarre and most inspiring situation Morgan had ever encountered, and it left her with a critical decision: wait for the official retrieval team to catch up and hope they would mount a proper rescue, or act on the intelligence she now had and attempt to locate Captain Keller herself, with only a pack of extraordinary dogs as allies. She knelt beside the Malinois, gently stroking its head. "Your handler trained you well," she said softly, "and somehow you've managed something I wouldn't have believed possible." The military dog looked at her with those intelligent amber eyes, then deliberately turned its gaze toward the maps showing the Freeman compound. Morgan followed its gaze, then looked at the German shepherd still standing sentinel and at the other dogs arranged throughout the cave, all watching her, all waiting for her decision. In that moment, she understood with perfect clarity what she was being asked to do. These weren't just animals acting on instinct or training. They were demonstrating loyalty, purpose, and courage that put human capabilities to shame. And they were asking her, with every expectant look and patient posture, to join their mission. Morgan Reed had come to Blackridge Station seeking isolation from human complications. She had built walls around her life and her heart, convinced that solitude was the safest path after the trauma of war. But here, in this hidden cave surrounded by the most unlikely allies imaginable, those walls were crumbling. Because some causes transcended personal comfort. Some loyalties demanded action regardless of risk, and some moments defined who you truly were, beyond all pretense and protection. "Okay," she said, rising to her feet with newfound resolve. "We find Captain Keller together." The German Shepherd made a soft sound of what could only be interpreted as approval. The Malinois stood, pressing against Morgan's leg in silent solidarity. Outside, the distant sound of the helicopter had faded, but Morgan knew the respite was temporary. Night would fall in a few hours, providing cover for what would undoubtedly be the most unorthodox rescue operation ever attempted. As she began to study the maps more carefully, formulating a plan, Morgan felt something she hadn't experienced since her days as a combat medic, the clarity and purpose that came with absolute conviction. Whatever happened next, she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done, and she was not alone. Not anymore. Dusk settled over the forest, transforming the landscape into layers of deepening shadow. Morgan had spent the afternoon studying Captain Keller's maps and notes, piecing together the failed operation and formulating a rescue plan. The more she learned, the more she understood the gravity of their situation. The Freemen weren't just anti-government extremists, they were deeply involved in weapons trafficking. Keller's notes detailed surveillance of a major shipment, military-grade, weapons being moved through national forest land to avoid detection. The joint DEA and military operation had been designed to intercept this shipment and apprehend the leadership. Something had gone catastrophically wrong. Morgan sat back against the cave wall, processing everything. "So your handler and his team attempted to capture Blackwell during the weapons transfer," she said to the Malinois, who lay alert beside her. "But something went wrong, and now Keller is either captured or hiding in their compound." The military dog's ears twitched at the sound of its handler's name. The German Shepherd, who had been guarding the cave entrance, approached and made a soft huffing sound that Morgan had come to recognize as a signal. Several other dogs had gone out earlier, scouts, she presumed, and now they were returning. A sleek black dog with the distinctive build of a Belgian Shepherd mix slipped through the cave entrance, moving directly to the German Shepherd. The two canines stood close, and Morgan would have sworn they were communicating. Subtle ear movements, changes in posture, the smallest vocalizations. The Belgian Shepherd then approached Morgan, stopping a respectful distance away. "You've been watching the compound," Morgan guessed. The dog made no response, but its intent was clear. The scout was reporting back. Morgan returned to the maps, tracing potential approaches to the Freeman compound. The official retrieval team would have resources and manpower, but they'd also have protocols, warrant requirements, negotiation attempts, escalation procedures, all of which would take time Captain Keller might not have. "We move tonight," she decided, looking at her unlikely allies. Under cover of darkness, she outlined her plan, speaking it aloud despite knowing the dogs couldn't understand her words. Yet their focused attention suggested some level of comprehension, or at the very least, recognition of her intent. The approach would utilize a drainage culvert that ran beneath the compound's perimeter, marked on Keller's maps as a potential infiltration point. The culvert connected to a small stream that flowed near the base of the ridge where they currently sheltered. Morgan would enter alone. The opening was too small for multiple individuals moving together, while the dog pack created a diversion on the opposite side of the compound. "Once inside," Morgan continued, "I locate Captain Keller, assess his condition, and extract if possible. If extraction isn't immediately viable, I establish contact and relay his position to the retrieval team." She looked directly at the Malinois. "You're the key. You can find him by scent, but your leg won't allow you to navigate the culvert. You'll need to stay with the German Shepherd until I signal." The military dog stared at her with unmistakable disapproval. "I know you want to come," Morgan said softly. But tactically, this is our best option. I need you at full strength. If extraction becomes necessary. The Malinois continued its intent gaze before finally lowering its head slightly. Not quite submission, but reluctant acceptance. Morgan checked her watch. Full darkness would arrive in 30 minutes. Time to prepare. She gathered essential equipment. Her sidearm with spare ammunition, a tactical flashlight, zip ties for restraints if needed, basic medical supplies, and Captain Keller's ID. She dressed in the darkest clothing she had, using mud from the cave. Floor to dull any reflective surfaces on her equipment. The dog pack had grown restless, sensing the imminent operation. Several had already left the cave, presumably to take up positions around the compound. The German Shepherd remained, along with the Malinois and 2 others who appeared to be serving as close protection. "All right," Morgan said, securing the last of her gear. "Let's move." They exited the cave into near-complete darkness. The clouds had thickened again, obscuring the moon and stars. Perfect conditions for their approach, though it would make navigation more challenging. Morgan used her flashlight sparingly, trusting the dog's superior night vision to guide their descent from the ridge. The forest had transformed in the darkness, familiar landmarks disappearing into shadow. But the dogs moved with confidence, leading Morgan along game trails and natural pathways she would never have found alone. The German Shepherd took point, with the Malinois staying close to Morgan's side despite its injury. As they approached the stream that would lead to the infiltration point, Morgan sensed a shift in the pack's energy. More dogs materialized from the darkness, gathering around the German Shepherd in what appeared to be a final coordination. There were soft sounds, not quite barks or whines, but deliberate vocalizations that seemed to carry specific meanings. Morgan crouched beside the Malinois, speaking softly. "I don't know what you all are, or how any of this is possible, but I've never seen anything like what you've accomplished." She gently stroked the military dog's head. "We're going to find your handler. That's a promise." The Malinois leaned briefly against her hand, a moment of connection that transcended the barriers between species. Then it straightened, professionalism reasserting itself as it prepared for the mission ahead. The German Shepherd approached, standing directly before Morgan. Its scarred face and intense eyes reflected a history and intelligence that defied explanation. Then, to Morgan's astonishment, it deliberately extended its paw. Morgan stared for a moment before understanding. She took the offered paw in her, and, completing the gesture, a pact sealed between unlikely allies. "See you on the other side," she said quietly. With that, the dog pack dispersed into the forest, moving with purpose toward their assigned positions. Only the Malinois remained, clearly reluctant to separate from the rescue mission for its handler. "I'll find him," Morgan promised again. "But I need you to trust me." The military dog held her gaze for a long moment, then turned to follow. The German Shepherd. The movement was clearly painful on its injured leg, but the dog's determination never wavered. Morgan watched them disappear into the darkness, then turned toward the stream. According to Keller's maps, the drainage culvert was approximately half a mile downstream, where the water curved closest to the compound perimeter. She moved carefully along the stream bank, using the sound of running water to guide her and illuminating her path with only occasional flashes of her light. The footing was treacherous, mud and loose stones, slick from recent rain. One misstep could mean injury or detection. After 20 minutes of cautious progress, Morgan spotted the culvert, a concrete tube about 3 feet in diameter, partially concealed by vegetation. A perfect infiltration point, hidden from casual observation, but large enough for a person to navigate. Keller had chosen his emergency access well. Morgan checked her watch. The diversion was scheduled to begin in 7 minutes, enough time for her to enter the culvert and reach its terminus near the compound's maintenance building. She performed a final equipment check, secured her pack, and switched her flashlight to its dimmest red light setting to preserve her night vision. The culvert was cold and damp, with several inches of water flowing through its bottom. Morgan crawled forward on hands and knees, trying to minimize splashing sounds. The confined space triggered memories of combat scenarios, close quarters, movement through hostile territory, the constant awareness of vulnerability. She focused on her breathing, pushing away the threatening edges of claustrophobia. The tube ran straight for about 30 yards before curving right. Morgan's knees were soaked and aching by the time she reached the bend. She paused, listening. Ahead, the sound quality changed, suggesting the culvert opened into a larger space soon. Right on schedule, a commotion erupted from the far side of the compound, barking, snarling, and the startled shouts of men. The diversion had begun. Morgan increased her pace, knowing her window of opportunity would be brief. The culvert ended in a concrete catchment basin inside a small utility shed. Morgan emerged cautiously, scanning for threats. The shed was empty, its door slightly ajar, allowing thin strips of artificial light to penetrate the darkness. Through the gap, she could see the Freeman compound in full operation. Security lights illuminated the central area between buildings, where armed men were now moving with purpose toward the disturbance. Radios crackled with tense communications. Orders were shouted. The diversion was drawing significant attention, just as planned. Morgan slipped from the shed, staying in the shadows along the perimeter of the nearest building, what appeared to be a supply storage structure based on Keller's notes. She needed to reach the largest cabin at the compound's center, where leadership would likely be based and where prisoners would probably be held. Moving from shadow to shadow, Morgan navigated between buildings, freezing whenever guards passed nearby. The dog pack was creating a masterful diversion, appearing in multiple locations, retreating, then reappearing elsewhere, giving the impression of a larger force testing the compound's defenses. She reached the main cabin unseen and pressed herself against its wall beside a window. Carefully she raised her head just enough to peer inside. The room beyond was spartanly furnished, a large table covered with maps and papers, several chairs, weapon racks along one wall. 3 men were inside arguing heatedly. One Morgan recognized immediately from the surveillance photos as Victor Blackwell, tall, heavily bearded, with a distinctive scar running through his right eyebrow. "I don't care what it takes," Blackwell was saying, his voice muffled through the glass. "Find that dog and kill it. If the military is looking for their man, that animal will lead them straight here." "We've been trying for 2 days," another man responded, younger and visibly nervous. "These aren't normal strays. They're organized, like they're working together." Blackwell slammed his fist on the table. "I don't want excuses. That Spec Ops bastard nearly cost us everything. We can't risk his dog bringing reinforcements." The third man, who had been silent, finally spoke. "What about our guest? He's not looking good." Blackwell's expression darkened. "The captain's usefulness is nearly at an end. Once we've moved the remaining shipment tonight, we won't need his access codes anymore. Make sure he talks, then finish it." Morgan's pulse quickened. Captain Keller was alive, at least for now, and being held somewhere in this compound. But time was running out. She ducked lower as one of the men approached the window, peering out at the continued commotion created by the dog pack. When he stepped away, Morgan continued her circuit of the building, searching for alternate entrances. At the rear, she found what she was looking for, a cellar door, secured with a padlock. Using her multi-tool, Morgan made quick work of the lock, eternally grateful for the skills her less rule-abiding army buddies had taught her between deployments. The cellar was pitch black. Morgan risked using her flashlight, keeping the beam tight and directed downward. Rough wooden stairs led to a dirt floor lined with shelves of supplies, food, ammunition, medical items. and at the far end, a heavy door with another padlock. Morgan approached silently, listening. From beyond the door came a sound that made her blood run cold, the labored breathing of someone in pain. The lock on this door was more substantial, but yielded to Morgan's determined efforts. She eased it open, flashlight beam penetrating the darkness beyond. The room was small and windowless, with a dirt floor and rough stone walls. It might once have been a root cellar, now repurposed as a holding cell. And chained to the wall, slumped in a seated position, was a man in tattered military fatigues. "Captain Keller," Morgan whispered, quickly closing the door behind her. The man's head lifted slowly, revealing a face bruised and cut, but recognizable from his ID photo. His eyes, though glazed with pain, sharpened with wariness. "Who are you?" His voice was raspy from dehydration. "Forest Ranger Morgan Reed," she answered, approaching carefully. "I'm here to get you out." Disbelief crossed his features. "How did you find me?" Morgan knelt beside him, examining his restraints, heavy chains secured to metal rings embedded in the wall, fastened to his wrists with padlocked cuffs. "Your dog led me here," she said, working on the locks, "along with about 20 other canine allies you apparently have in these woods." Keller's expression shifted from confusion to something like wonder. "Ajax is alive?" Then the rest of her statement registered. 20 dogs. "Your Malinois found me 2 days ago, injured but determined. And somehow he's organized what I can only describe as a canine special operations team." The first lock clicked open. "I've never seen anything like it. They've been searching for you, protected your hidden base, and are currently creating a diversion so I could infiltrate." Despite his condition, a smile touched Keller's cracked lips. "The CSAR program," he murmured. "It actually worked." CSAR? Canine Search and Rescue Initiative. Experimental program training military working dogs to coordinate with local strays for search operations in hostile territory. Keller winced as Morgan freed his second hand. Most brass thought it was impossible. Animals can't organize without human handlers, they said. But Ajax proved them wrong during field trials. We've been developing the protocol for 2 years. The pieces clicked into place for Morgan. The extraordinary coordination, the tactical movements, the clear chain of command among the dogs. Not mystical understanding, but specialized training pushed to its logical extreme. "We need to move," she said, helping Keller to his feet. "Your Ajax is waiting, but Blackwell plans to move the weapons tonight and then deal with you." Keller swayed dangerously but remained standing through obvious force of will. "Condition of the shipment? You're barely able to stand, and you're asking about the mission?" Morgan couldn't hide her disbelief. 3 years tracking this network," Keller said grimly. "If those weapons disappear tonight, it starts again, elsewhere." Morgan recognized the determination in his eyes, the same focus she'd seen in his K9 partner. "The main shipment was intercepted during your operation, according to Blackwell, but there's a remaining portion being moved tonight." Keller nodded, processing this information. "My team?" "Unknown. The retrieval team looking for Ajax might have information, but I didn't stick around to find out." Morgan helped Keller toward the door, supporting much of his weight. He was in worse shape than she'd initially assessed, dehydrated, beaten, possibly with cracked ribs based on his labored breathing. Extraction through the culvert would be impossible in his condition. "We need a vehicle," she said, peeking through the cellar door to ensure the way was clear, "and a different exit strategy." The diversion outside was continuing, but sounds suggested the Freemen were organizing a more coordinated response. Time was running short. They made it up the cellar stairs and back outside, staying close to the building's shadow. Keller leaned heavily against Morgan, each step clearly causing pain, but he remained silent and focused. "There," he whispered, indicating a jeep parked near one of the smaller cabins, keys likely inside the guard shack. Morgan assessed the distance, 30 yards of exposed ground between their position and the guard shack, then another 20. To the jeep. With Keller's condition, they'd never make it undetected. As if sensing her dilemma, a new commotion erupted at the compound's main entrance. Several men shouted in alarm, followed by the distinctive sound of a vehicle's engine being gunned to its limit. "What the hell?" Morgan murmured, risking a glance around the corner. A Forest Service truck, her truck, was plowing through the compound's gate, headlights blazing. Behind the wheel was nothing. No driver visible, just a large shape in the passenger seat that might have been the Malinois. "Ajax," Keller breathed, a note of pride in his voice. "He's creating a secondary diversion." The driverless truck careened through the compound, Freeman diving out of its path. Gunfire erupted as they attempted to stop the vehicle, only to be met with a chorus of snarling as dogs seemed to materialize from the shadows, harrying the armed men and creating further chaos. "Now," Morgan said, seizing the opportunity. They moved as quickly as Keller's condition allowed, reaching the guard shack unseen in the confusion. Inside, Morgan found keys hanging on a hook beside the door, labeled J2 in sloppy handwriting. The jeep was now only yards away, with most of the Freemen distracted by the combination of the runaway truck and the attacking dog pack. Morgan helped Keller into the passenger seat, then circled to the driver's side. Just as she opened the door, a shout came from behind her. "Stop right there!" Morgan turned to find Victor Blackwell himself, rifle raised and aimed directly at her chest. His face was contorted with rage, blood streaming from a bite wound on his forearm. "Forest Service," he spat. "Should have known the government would send more puppets." Morgan raised her hand slowly, mind racing through options. Her sidearm was holstered at her hip, impossible to reach without getting shot. Keller was in no condition to help. The dogs were engaged elsewhere in the compound. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into," Blackwell continued, moving closer, rifle unwavering. "But it ends here." A low growl emerged from the darkness behind Blackwell, a sound that raised primordial fear. The Freeman leader's eyes widened, but before he could turn, a blur of motion launched itself at him. The German Shepherd hit Blackwell with bone-crushing force, driving him to the ground. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air before spinning away across the dirt. Man and dog rolled in a violent struggle, Blackwell screaming as powerful jaws closed on his arm. "Go!" a voice shouted from nearby. Morgan turned to see one of the retrieval team members, a military officer in tactical gear, providing covering. Fire from the edge of the compound. "We've got this!" Morgan didn't need to be told twice. She leapt into the jeep, fired the engine, and accelerated away from the scene, navigating through the chaos of the compound. Behind them, more official vehicles were now pouring through the broken gate. The retrieval team had arrived in force, perfectly timed to capitalize on the distraction created by the dog pack. "Your people have good timing," Morgan told Keller, as they sped toward the forest road. "Not my people," Keller corrected, grimacing as the jeep bounced over rough terrain. "Called in some markers with local FBI, been feeding them intel on Blackwell for months as a contingency." They reached the main forest road, and Morgan increased speed, putting distance between them and the compound. The sounds of conflict faded behind them. "Ajax," Keller said suddenly, concern breaking through his controlled demeanor. "He's injured. We need to find him." "He'll find us," Morgan assured him. "That dog has capabilities I still can't fully comprehend." As if summoned by their conversation, a shape appeared in the road ahead, the Malinois, standing tall despite its injuries. Morgan slowed the jeep, and Ajax approached, amber eyes fixing on his handler with unmistakable recognition. Morgan helped, Keller from the vehicle, supporting him as he knelt painfully to greet his canine partner. The reunion between man and dog transcended words. Ajax pressing against Keller, the captain's arms encircling his companion with a bond forged through years of service and loyalty. "You found me," Keller whispered, burying his face in the dog's fur. "Against all odds, you found me." From the surrounding forest, more shapes emerged, the extraordinary pack that had made this rescue possible. They maintained a respectful distance from the reunion, but their presence completed the circle of this remarkable story. The German Shepherd appeared last, moving with dignity despite fresh wounds from its encounter with Blackwell. It approached. Morgan, who knelt to meet its gaze at eye level. "Thank you," she said simply. The pack leader blinked once, then turned to look at Keller and Ajax before returning its gaze to Morgan. The message seemed clear. Mission accomplished. As sirens wailed in the distance, medical support and additional law enforcement approaching, Reed found herself at the center of something she could never have imagined when she first took the isolated posting at Blackridge Station. She had sought solitude, an escape from human connections and their inherent complications. Instead, she discovered that sometimes the most profound connections transcended species and language. That loyalty and courage recognized no boundaries, and that even in the wilderness, no one was truly alone if they opened their heart to unexpected allies. The remarkable pack of dogs began to melt back into the forest, their extraordinary mission complete. Some would eventually be identified as former military working dogs gone missing in action, others as abandoned pets who had found purpose in the wilderness. Their story would become legend among handlers and trainers, proof that the bonds between humans and canines could achieve the seemingly impossible. As for Morgan Reed, her days of isolation ended that night. In helping Captain Keller and Ajax, she had rediscovered her own capacity for connection with humans and animals alike. The walls she had built around her heart lay in ruins, like the gates of the Freeman compound, and as dawn broke over the mountains, painting the forest in gold and promise, Morgan knew that some acts of compassion created ripples that changed everything. A simple offering of water to a wounded canine had led to an extraordinary alliance, a daring rescue, and a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone. Sometimes, salvation arrived with fur and four paws, asking nothing in return but the chance to fulfill the ancient pact between humans and dogs, a bond of loyalty that had endured through thousands of years and would continue for thousands more. The sun crested over the eastern ridgeline, bathing Clearwater National Forest in golden light. Morgan sat on the hood of her battered Forest Service truck, watching as federal agents secured the Freeman compound. The night's operation had transitioned seamlessly from rescue mission to major law enforcement action, with multiple agencies descending on Victor Blackwell's operation. Captain Keller had been evacuated by medical helicopter an hour earlier, his condition stable but requiring proper treatment. Ajax, after a touching farewell to his handler, had remained behind, the military K-9 seemingly unwilling to leave until certain all aspects of the mission were complete. The Malinois now sat beside Morgan, alert despite its injuries and the exhaustion that must have been weighing on it. Beyond the compound's perimeter, shadowy forms still moved among the trees, the remarkable pack maintaining their vigilance even as the human authorities took control. "Ranger Reed?" A woman in an FBI windbreaker approached, tablet in hand. "I'm Special Agent Diana Winters. I'd like to get your statement while events are fresh." Morgan nodded, sliding off the truck's hood. "Of course." "Would you mind if we record this conversation?" Agent Winters asked, indicating the tablet. "That's fine." The agent activated the recording and led Morgan to a quieter area away from the operational hub. Ajax followed, staying close to Morgan's side. "Let's start from the beginning," Winters said. "You first encountered the military working dog. Ajax, I believe Captain Keller called him, 2 days ago." Morgan recounted the events chronologically, finding the injured Malinois, treating its wounds, the appearance of the extraordinary dog pack, and her decision to follow their lead rather than wait for the official retrieval team. She described the hidden operations base, the infiltration of the Freeman compound, and the coordinated effort that had ultimately rescued Captain Keller and helped bring down Blackwell's organization. Throughout her account, Agent Winters maintained a professional neutrality, though her eyebrows occasionally rose at the more unbelievable aspects of the story. "And you're saying these dogs, approximately 20 mixed-breed strays, operated with tactical coordination, without human handlers?" The skepticism in her voice was evident. Morgan met her gaze steadily. "I know how it sounds. I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't witnessed it. But Captain Keller mentioned something called the CSAR program, an experimental initiative training military dogs to recruit and coordinate with local strays for search operations." Winters made a note on her tablet. "We've received preliminary confirmation that such a program exists, though it's classified. Most of the details will likely remain need to know." She glanced at Ajax, who was watching their conversation with obvious comprehension, "Though I think the results speak for themselves." A commotion near the main compound building drew their attention. Victor Blackwell was being led out in handcuffs, his face a mask of rage. The right side of his body bore visible evidence of his encounter with the German Shepherd, torn clothing and bandaged wounds that would eventually become scars. As Blackwell was placed in a transport vehicle, a low growl emanated from the forest edge. Morgan turned to see the German Shepherd standing in the shadow of a large pine, its scarred face focused entirely on the Freeman leader. The pack Alpha made no move to approach, but maintained its watch until the vehicle doors closed and Blackwell disappeared from view. "Remarkable," Winters murmured, following Morgan's gaze. "I've worked with K9 units for years, but I've never seen anything like this." She turned back to Morgan. "You realize that your actions, while ultimately successful, violated numerous protocols and regulations?" Morgan nodded. "I do." "You left your post without authorization, withheld information from your supervisor, interfered with an ongoing federal investigation, and participated in what could be classified as a vigilante operation." "I made the judgment call I felt was necessary given the circumstances," Morgan replied, unflinching. "Captain Keller would likely have been killed if we'd waited for official channels to clear the rescue operation." Winters studied her for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "Off the record, I think you made the right call." She deactivated the recording. "And from what I'm hearing, your actions will be classified as extraordinary assistance to federal authorities during an emergency situation, rather than anything carrying disciplinary consequences." Relief washed through Morgan. She hadn't considered the professional ramifications of her choices, not when a man's life hung in the balance, but the thought of losing her position at Blackridge Station was painful. Despite everything, she'd grown attached to her small corner of the wilderness. "What happens now?" Morgan asked, watching as agents continued processing the scene. "Now?" Winters gestured toward the ongoing operation. "Blackwell and his organization will face federal charges for weapons trafficking, assault on federal officers, and likely terrorism-related counts once we fully process the intelligence gathered here. Captain Keller will receive medical treatment and debriefing. And you—" She paused, looking thoughtfully at Morgan. "You'll likely have some decisions to make." "Decisions?" "Captain Keller's unit has expressed significant interest in your background as both a former combat medic and someone with demonstrated ability to work with these specialized K9 assets. The CSAR program is expanding, apparently." Morgan blinked, surprised. "I'm a forest ranger." "For now," Winters replied with a knowing smile. "But opportunities have a way of finding people who demonstrate exceptional capability in crisis situations." She handed Morgan a business card. "When things settle, give me a call. I know people who would be very interested in speaking with you." Before Morgan could respond, a military vehicle pulled into the compound. A woman in army uniform emerged, tall, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. She scanned the scene before her gaze locked onto Ajax. Her face registered momentary surprise, followed by evident relief. "Major Cassidy," Winters said by way of explanation. "Captain Keller's commanding officer and director of the CSAR program. She's here for Ajax." The major approached, her attention divided between Morgan and the Malinois. "Ranger Reed? I'm Major Samantha Cassidy. I understand we owe you a considerable debt of gratitude." "I just did what needed doing," Morgan replied, uncomfortable with the recognition. "Ajax and his team did the real work." Cassidy's expression softened as she knelt beside the military dog, checking his injuries with gentle hands. "He exceeded every parameter we established for the program. Even our most optimistic projections didn't anticipate this level of independent operation." She looked up at Morgan. "And you say he successfully coordinated with local strays to mount a rescue operation?" "Not just coordinated," Morgan clarified. "They operated like a specialized unit. Different dogs had different roles: scouts, perimeter security, diversionary tactics. They maintained formations and communication signals. It was unlike anything I've ever seen." The major nodded, a mixture of pride and scientific interest in her eyes. The CSAR initiative was designed to leverage the natural social structures of canines enhanced through specialized training. The concept was that in remote or hostile environments, a properly trained military working dog could recruit local dogs to assist with search and rescue operations. Many were skeptical that it would work at all, let alone to this degree. Ajax stood, pressing briefly against Morgan's leg before moving to Major Cassidy's side, acknowledging the change in command while maintaining the connection they'd formed during their shared mission. "He'll receive full medical attention and then return to training," Cassidy assured Morgan, noting her concerned gaze. "Though after this demonstration, I suspect Ajax has earned a significant role in developing the program further." A thought occurred to Morgan. "What about the pack, the other dogs?" Cassidy glanced toward the forest edge, where shadows still moved among the trees. "That's a good question. Officially, they're strays and technically under local animal control jurisdiction. Unofficially," she hesitated, "given their demonstrated capabilities and the classified nature of the program, we've made arrangements with a specialized training facility in Montana. Those that can be safely approached will be evaluated for potential integration into the U program. The others will be provided territory within a secure conservation area where they can live naturally but continue to be studied." Relief flooded through Morgan. She'd grown unexpectedly attached to these remarkable animals, particularly the scarred German Shepherd that had led them so effectively. The thought of them being treated as ordinary strays and possibly euthanized had been weighing on her mind. "They deserve that much, at least," she said quietly. "They deserve more," Cassidy agreed. "And we intend to ensure they receive it." Captain Keller was most insistent on that point, even from his hospital bed. A soft whine drew their attention. The German Shepherd had emerged from the forest and now stood at a respectful distance, watching their conversation. Instead of its usual commanding presence, the pack leader now displayed an almost formal posture, as if preparing for the conclusion of their shared mission. Ajax turned toward the German shepherd, then looked questioningly at Major Cassidy. The officer, seemingly understanding the unspoken request, nodded her permission. The Malinois approached his unlikely ally, and the two dogs stood face to face in silent communion. "I've never seen anything like this," Cassidy murmured, watching the interaction with scholarly fascination. Morgan said nothing, recognizing the moment for what it was, a farewell between comrades who had achieved something extraordinary together. After several seconds, the German shepherd turned and melted back into the forest. One by one, the shadowy forms among the trees disappeared as well, the remarkable pack returning to the wilderness that had shaped them. Ajax watched them go, then returned to Cassidy's side, duty and training reasserting themselves. "Will I be able to see him again?" Morgan asked, surprising herself with the question. "To check on his recovery?" Major Cassidy studied her thoughtfully. "I think that could be arranged. In fact, given your unique experience with this operation, there might be a place for someone with your background in the program's next phase, if you were interested." The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and tantalizing. Morgan had chosen the isolation of Blackridge Station deliberately, seeking escape from the complexities of human connection after her military service. Yet the events of the past days had reawakened something she'd thought lost, a sense of purpose, of belonging to something larger than herself. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "Do that." Cassidy handed her a business card similar to Agent Winters. "In the meantime, I imagine you could use some rest. It's been an extraordinary few days." As the Major departed with Ajax, Morgan found herself alone amidst the bustling operation, a strange feeling after the intensity of their shared mission. She made her way back to her truck, intending to return to Blackridge Station for some much-needed sleep. A figure leaned against the vehicle, Tim Holcomb, her supervisor, looking simultaneously impressed and exasperated. "Should have known you'd be in the middle of all this," he said by way of greeting. "When you missed your check-in, I figured you were just dealing with storm damage. Instead, you're taking down domestic terrorists with a pack of wild dogs." Morgan smiled wearily. "Not exactly how I planned to spend my week." "Plans change." Tim handed her a paper cup of steaming coffee from a thermos. "Especially when you have a habit of putting yourself between people in trouble and the things troubling them." The coffee was strong and sweet, just what Morgan needed after the night's exertions. She savored it for a moment before responding. "I didn't do much, mostly just followed Ajax's lead," Tim snorted. "Right, that's why the FBI agent in charge just told me you're being recommended for a civilian service medal." "Because you didn't do much." Morgan stared at him, coffee cup halfway to her lips. "What? You heard me." Tim's expression grew serious. "You did good, Reed. Real good. Though next time, maybe give your supervisor a heads up before you go. Commando on a militia compound." "Next time," Morgan repeated, the words feeling strange in her mouth. There wouldn't be a next time, would there? Her life was patrolling trails, posting notices, and keeping campers from burning down the forest. Not infiltrating armed compounds with K9 special operators. Yet even as she thought it, Morgan knew something fundamental had shifted. The careful isolation she'd constructed at Blackridge Station had been irrevocably breached, not just by the extraordinary events of the past days, but by her own willingness to engage with them, to connect again, both with humans and with the remarkable dogs who had taught her so much about loyalty and purpose. "You heading back to the station?" Tim asked, interrupting her thoughts. Morgan nodded. "Need to clean up and sleep for about 12 hours. Take a few days, official administrative leave while all this gets sorted out." He gestured toward the operation around them. "I'll have someone cover your duties." "Thanks." Morgan started to climb into her truck, then paused. "Tim, how did you know I was here? I didn't exactly file a situation report." Her supervisor grinned. Got a strange call on the emergency band early this morning. No voice, just some weird sounds. Then barking, lots of barking. GPS trace put it right near this location. He shrugged, figured it had to involve you somehow. Morgan stared at him, then broke into surprised laughter, the first genuine laughter she'd experienced in longer than she could remember. The tension of the past days released in that moment, leaving behind a peculiar lightness. "Get some rest," Tim said, still smiling. "And Morgan, I'm glad you found whatever it is you were looking for out here." As she drove away from the compound, Morgan reflected on his words. She hadn't come to Blackridge Station looking for anything. Quite the opposite. She'd sought emptiness, silence, the absence of connection after the trauma of war. The perfect, hiding place from life itself. Instead, she'd found purpose in the most unexpected form, a wounded military dog who refused to abandon his mission and who had somehow awakened the same stubborn loyalty within her. The forest road wound through stands of pine and spruce, morning sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns. Morgan drove carefully, aware of the fatigue weighing on her limbs after the night's exertion. Her mind, however, remained active, processing all that had occurred. Halfway to the ranger station, movement at the roadside caught her attention. Morgan slowed, then stopped altogether. The German shepherd stood in a small clearing beside the road, watching her approach with those intelligent eyes. Behind it, partially visible among the trees, were several other members of the pack, the border collie, the Belgian shepherd mix, others whose distinctive features she'd come to recognize. Morgan stepped out of the truck, leaving the engine running. She approached slowly, maintaining a respectful distance from the wild dogs who had proven themselves anything but ordinary strays. "You're still here," she said softly to the German. "Shepherd." The pack leader regarded her steadily, scarred face catching the morning light. Then with deliberate movement, it approached until only a few feet separated them. The dog sat, its posture almost formal, eyes never leaving Morgan's face. Understanding dawned. "You're saying goodbye." The German shepherd blinked once, then rose and turned toward the forest. The other dogs moved in response, forming into their now familiar coordinated grouping. At the edge of the trees, the pack leader paused, looking back one final time. Morgan straightened, offering a formal salute to the extraordinary animal that had led its pack with such remarkable purpose and intelligence. "Thank you," she said simply. The German shepherd held her gaze for a long moment, then disappeared. Into the forest, the pack following in perfect formation. Within seconds they were gone, melting into the wilderness as if they had never been anything but shadow and mystery. Yet Morgan knew they had been real, knew that for a brief, remarkable time, she had been part of something that transcended ordinary understanding, a mission that had crossed the boundaries between species and reminded her of what truly mattered: courage, loyalty, and the willingness to risk everything for those under your protection. As she returned to her truck and continued toward Blackridge Station, Morgan felt the weight of isolation lifting from her shoulders. The forest around her no longer seemed like a refuge from connection, but a living community of which she was an integral part. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Probably Tim, with an update on the situation at the compound, but it could also be Major Cassidy, or Agent Winters, or even the hospital with news about Captain Keller's condition. Connections forming, responsibilities, extending beyond the boundaries she had so carefully constructed. Morgan smiled as she drove, the morning sun warm on her face. Whatever came next, whether continuing her role as forest ranger or exploring the possibilities offered by the CSAR program, she would face it with the lessons learned from Ajax, from the remarkable pack, and from her own rediscovered courage. Sometimes the most profound change began with the simplest act of compassion. A ranger giving water to a wounded military dog had set in motion events that transformed not just her life, but the lives of everyone touched by their extraordinary journey. And sometimes, Morgan reflected as Blackridge Station came into view, the most powerful allies arrived on 4 paws, asking nothing in return but the chance to fulfill their purpose alongside those who recognized their true worth. She parked her truck beside the cabin that had been her sanctuary and her prison. Now it would be simply her home, a base from which to engage with the world rather than hide from it. Morgan stepped onto the porch, feeling the familiar boards. Beneath her feet, seeing the space with new eyes. Tomorrow would bring debriefings, decisions, and the beginning of whatever came next. But today was for rest, for reflection, and for honoring the remarkable alliance that had reminded her what it meant to truly live rather than merely survive. Morgan Reed, ranger and reluctant hero, entered her cabin not as a solitary figure but as someone who had rediscovered her place in the web of connection that sustained all life. And somewhere in the forest depths, a pack of extraordinary dogs continued their silent patrol, guardians of the wilderness and embodiments of the unbreakable bond between humans and the animals who had chosen, millennia ago, to share their journey through this world. Some stories ended, but the best ones, the ones that mattered most, simply opened the door to new beginnings. 3 weeks after the Freemen compound raid, Morgan stood on the porch of Blackridge Station, watching a summer thunderstorm build over the western ridges. Dark clouds gathered like bruises against the late afternoon sky, promising rain by nightfall. She breathed deeply, savoring the electric scent of approaching precipitation and the subtle shift in air pressure that made the forest seem to hold its breath in anticipation. The station had changed little in her absence, a testament to Tim's promise to have someone cover her duties during her administrative leave. Yet Morgan herself had changed profoundly, transformed by her experiences with Ajax and the extraordinary dog pack that had come to her aid. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, one of many calls and messages she'd received since the operation concluded. This time, it was Captain Keller, checking in as he had every few days during his recovery. "Reed," she answered, leaning against the porch railing. "How's the wilderness today?" Keller's voice was stronger than when she'd last visited him in the hospital, the lingering hoarseness from his ordeal nearly gone. "Moody, storm coming in from the west." She smiled, still somewhat surprised by how easily they'd fallen into this rhythm of regular communication. "How's physical therapy?" "Brutal but effective. Doctor says I'm ahead of schedule." A pause. "Ajax is back from his medical evaluation. Clean bill of health. He's been insufferable about it, strutting around the kennel like he's giving the other dogs seminars on fieldwork." Morgan laughed, picturing the dignified Malinois somehow managing to look smug. "I'm not surprised. He's earned some bragging rights." "Speaking of earned rights," Keller's tone shifted slightly, "Major Cassidy asked me to check if you'd considered her offer." The offer, a civilian consultant position with the CSAR program, utilizing Morgan's unique combination of medical training, wilderness expertise, and demonstrated ability to work with the specialized canine teams. It represented an entirely different path than the solitary ranger role she'd chosen after leaving the military. "I'm still thinking," Morgan replied, though in truth she'd been doing little else for weeks. "No pressure," Keller said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But the program is expanding after the success of the Blackwell operation. We're establishing a permanent training facility in Montana, adjacent to a wilderness preserve. The territory would make Blackridge look like a city park." Morgan smiled at the transparent attempt to appeal to her love of wild spaces. "Subtle, Captain." "I don't do subtle well. Combat training." The humor in his voice faded to something more serious. "Look, Reed, I owe you my life. I'm not asking you to join because of that debt, though it exists. I'm asking because what you did out there, how you worked with Ajax and that pack, it was remarkable. The program needs people who understand both the human and canine sides of the equation. Morgan watched lightning flicker in the distant clouds, considering her response. The weeks of administrative leave had given her time to reflect on what she truly wanted from her life. The isolation that had once seemed like sanctuary now felt increasingly like hiding from connection, from purpose, from the very aspects of existence that gave it meaning. "I'll have an answer soon," she promised. "Just need to tie up some loose ends here first." "Fair enough. And Morgan?" Keller rarely used her first name. "Whatever you decide, Ajax and I owe you a debt we can never fully repay." After ending the call, Morgan remained on the porch, watching the approaching storm, while her mind worked through the decision facing her. The administrative leave was ending tomorrow. Time to either resume her duties at Blackridge Station or take a different path entirely. A movement at the forest edge caught her attention. A deer, perhaps, or one of the many small creatures that inhabited the wilderness around the station. Morgan squinted, focusing on the shadowy space between two large pines. For a brief moment, she thought she glimpsed a familiar silhouette, a large dog with the distinctive profile of a German shepherd. Then the shape was gone, melted back into the forest as if it had never been there at all. Morgan straightened, scanning the tree line more intently. Had it been real or merely wishful thinking? The pack had disappeared after that final farewell on the forest road, presumably moving deeper into the wilderness, or perhaps found and integrated into the CSAR program, as Major Cassidy had suggested. Yet something about that fleeting glimpse felt significant, a reminder of connections that persisted even when not immediately visible. Before she could ponder further, the sound of a vehicle approaching drew her attention. The familiar forest service truck belonged to Tim, who had been handling administrative matters at the regional office all day. He parked beside Morgan's vehicle and emerged carrying a manila envelope. "Good timing," he called over the rising wind. "Storm's going to break soon." Morgan met him at the steps. How was the bureaucratic gauntlet? About what you'd expect. Forms signed in triplicate, narratives analyzed from every angle, and a whole lot of brass trying to make sense of what happened. Tim shook his head with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "Speaking of which," he held out the envelope, "your official reinstatement papers. All cleared to resume normal duties tomorrow." Morgan took the envelope, feeling its weight in more ways than one. "Thanks for handling all that. Part of the job." Tim studied her face. "Though I'm starting to wonder if you'll be using these." De Morgan raised an eyebrow. "What makes you say that?" "I'm not blind, Reed. Those military types who've been calling and visiting, the way you've been looking at the horizon more than the station itself." He smiled slightly. "You're weighing options. Good ones, I'm guessing." She shouldn't have been surprised by his perceptiveness. Tim had been a ranger for over 20 years. Reading people was as much a part of his skill set as reading weather. Patterns. "Major Cassidy offered me a position with the CSAR program," Morgan admitted. "Civilian consultant, based at their new training facility in Montana." Tim nodded, unsurprised. "Going to take it?" "I haven't decided." A distant rumble of thunder punctuated her words, and the first fat raindrops began to fall, pattering against the cabin roof. "Let's continue this inside," Tim suggested. Once they were settled at the small kitchen table with coffee brewing, Tim leaned back in his chair, considering her with experienced eyes. "When you first applied for this posting, I had my doubts," he said frankly. "Your qualifications were exceptional, but something in your application letter felt like you were running away, not moving toward. Know what I mean?" Morgan nodded, reluctantly. There was little point denying it. "Isolation can be healing," Tim continued. God knows I've used these forests that way myself over the years, but eventually most people need to reconnect, find purpose beyond simply existing. And you think this CSAR position is that purpose? Tim shrugged. That's for you to decide. But I saw you after that operation, Morgan. I saw the light in your eyes when you talked about working with those dogs, about what you accomplished together. That wasn't the look of someone who wants to go back to posting trail notices and checking campfire permits. Morgan stared into her coffee cup, feeling the truth of his words settle in her chest. The quiet life she'd built at Blackridge had served its purpose, a transitional space between the trauma of war and whatever came next. But what had once felt like sanctuary increasingly felt like stagnation. I've been seeing the German Shepherd, she admitted quietly, or thinking I have, glimpses at the forest edge, never clear enough to be certain. Instead of dismissing her, Tim nodded thoughtfully. Maybe it's keeping an eye on you. These mountains have always held more mysteries than we give them credit for. The storm broke in earnest, rain lashing against the windows as lightning illuminated the darkening forest. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, listening to the elements rage outside while the small cabin remained warm and secure. You know, Tim finally said, your position here isn't going anywhere. The Forest Service has existed for over a century, and it'll be here if you ever want to come back. The simple statement lifted a weight Morgan hadn't realized she was carrying, the fear that choosing a new path meant permanently closing another. Thanks, Tim, for everything. Just doing my job. He stood, gathering his raincoat. Think about what I said. And Morgan, whatever you decide, make it, because you're moving towards something, not away. After Tim left, braving the downpour to return to his own cabin further down the service road, Morgan sat alone at the table, turning her options over in her mind. Outside, the storm continued its percussion against the cabin, a natural soundtrack to her thoughts. The decision crystallized gradually, like sediment settling in still water. By the time the storm began to abate, leaving only gentle rain in its wake, Morgan knew what she needed to do. She spent the evening organizing her belongings. Not many, as she'd always lived simply, and preparing the station for transition to whoever might take her place. The task was bittersweet, closing a chapter that had served its purpose while opening space for whatever came next. As night fell, Morgan stepped onto the porch one last time, listening to the forest sounds emerging after the storm. Somewhere, in that darkness, were creatures large and small, living their wild lives according to ancient rhythms. And perhaps, moving silent as shadows between the trees, a remarkable pack of dogs continued their extraordinary existence. Morgan raised her phone and dialed Major Cassidy's number. "I've made my decision," she said when the officer answered. "I'd like to accept the position with CSAR." "Excellent." Cassidy's voice held genuine pleasure. "We were hoping you'd say that. When can you report to the Montana facility?" "I need to finalize my resignation and hand over the ranger station. 3 days?" "Perfect. I'll email the details and have quarters prepared for you." A pause. "Captain Keller will be pleased. He's been quite the advocate for bringing you on board." After ending the call, Morgan remained on the porch, watching the clouds part, to reveal stars emerging in the night sky. The decision felt right, not just a new job, but a continuation of the extraordinary connection she'd formed with Ajax and his remarkable pack. Morning brought clear skies and renewed purpose. Morgan submitted her formal resignation, arranged for temporary coverage until a permanent replacement could be found, and began packing her few possessions for the journey to Montana. By afternoon, everything was ready. Her truck was loaded, the cabin cleaned and prepared for the next occupant. All that remained was one final circuit of her territory, a farewell to the wilderness that had sheltered her during a crucial transition in her life. Morgan hiked to Eagle Point, the highest outlook in her jurisdiction, reaching it as the sun began its westward descent. The view was spectacular, miles of unbroken forest stretching to distant mountains, the silver ribbon of Clearwater River winding through valleys below. This land had been her sanctuary, her healing space, and now it would be her foundation for moving forward rather than her hiding place. As she stood absorbing the panorama, a sound behind her broke the silence, the soft crunch of paws on gravel. Morgan turned slowly, heart quickening with anticipation. The German shepherd stood 20 feet away, watching her with those intelligent eyes that had guided their extraordinary mission. It looked healthy and strong, its scarred face catching the late afternoon light. "Hello again," Morgan said softly. The dog made no sound, but its focused attention conveyed recognition. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the distance, woman and wild creature, connected by shared experience that defied conventional understanding. Then, with deliberate movement, the German shepherd approached until only a few feet separated them. It sat, maintaining eye contact with an almost formal dignity. "I'm leaving," Morgan told it, feeling no self-consciousness about speaking to the animal as an equal. "Taking a position with the CSAR program, working with Ajax and Captain Keller." The dog tilted its head slightly, ears forward with evident interest. Morgan smiled. "I don't know if you can understand everything I'm saying, but I wanted to thank you for trusting me, for showing me that connections matter even when they cross boundaries we think are uncrossable." The German shepherd blinked once, slowly, then rose and turned slightly, looking back over its shoulder with clear expectation. "You want me to follow you?" The dog moved a few paces down the trail, then paused, looking back again. Morgan hesitated, only briefly before following, curiosity overwhelming any lingering caution. They descended from the outlook together, the German shepherd setting a pace that allowed Morgan to keep up easily while navigating the uneven terrain. After about 20 minutes, they emerged into a small clearing Morgan had never noticed before. Despite her many patrols of this area, the space felt almost deliberately created, a perfect circle of open ground surrounded by protective stands of pine and spruce. The German shepherd walked to the center of the clearing and stopped, turning to face Morgan again. As if responding to an unheard signal, shapes emerged from the surrounding forest. First one, then two, then many. The pack had assembled, materializing from shadows and undergrowth with the same coordinated movement Morgan remembered. She recognized several individuals. The border collie who had helped carry Captain Keller's backpack, the Belgian shepherd mix who had scouted the Freeman compound, the Doberman cross who had flanked their escape. Others were familiar from the peripheral roles they had played during the rescue operation. "You're all still here," Morgan said softly, wonder coloring her voice. "Still together." The pack arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, the German shepherd at their center. There was purpose in their formation, intention in their collective presence. Morgan stood very still, sensing the significance of the moment. These extraordinary animals had chosen to reveal themselves one final time before her departure. A farewell from allies who had shared a remarkable journey. "I won't forget," she promised them. "What we did together, what you showed me was possible. I'll carry that forward." The German shepherd studied her for a long moment, then deliberately lowered its head in what could only be described as a bow. One by one, the other dogs followed suit, a formal acknowledgement that transcended the boundaries between species. Morgan returned the gesture, bending at the waist with hands at her sides, respect offered freely between equals. When she straightened, the German shepherd had already turned away, moving toward the forest edge with purposeful strides. The pack followed in perfect formation, dissolving into the shadows between trees until only their leader remained visible at the very edge of the clearing. The scarred dog paused there, looking back one final time. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that needed no words, a connection that would persist despite physical separation. Then the German shepherd was gone, vanished, into the wilderness that had shaped it. Morgan stood alone in the clearing, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the ground. Yet she didn't feel alone, not truly. The connections forged during their shared mission remained, invisible threads linking her to Ajax, to Captain Keller, to Major Cassidy and the CSAR program, and to the remarkable pack that had changed everything. She made her way back to Blackridge Station as twilight settled over the forest, casting the familiar cabin in the golden-purple light of ending day. Her packed truck waited, ready for tomorrow's journey to Montana and the new chapter that awaited her there. Morgan took one final look at the small ranger station that had been her sanctuary and her prison. Then she turned toward the forest, raising her hand in silent farewell to the wilderness and its extraordinary guardians. Some stories appeared to end, only to reveal themselves as beginnings in disguise. Morgan Reed had come to Blackridge Station, seeking isolation, a retreat from the connections that seemed too painful to maintain after the trauma of war. She departed now toward connection, purpose, and the profound understanding that the most meaningful bonds often arrived in unexpected forms. As night fell over Clearwater National Forest, a lone howl echoed through the darkness. Not a wolf, but something equally wild and purposeful, a farewell perhaps, or a promise. Either way, it followed Morgan into her dreams as she slept one final night in the cabin, preparing for the journey ahead. Morning would bring new horizons, new challenges, and the continuation of a partnership that had begun with the simplest act of compassion. A ranger giving water to a wounded military dog. What had followed had transformed not just her life, but her understanding of what was possible when courage, loyalty, and connection converged. The wilderness had many lessons to teach those willing to listen. Morgan Reed had learned perhaps the most important one of all, that no one, human or animal, was meant to journey entirely alone, and that sometimes the most profound alliances formed in the most unlikely circumstances between beings who recognized in each other the same essential qualities: resilience, purpose, and the capacity for extraordinary connection. As stars wheeled overhead and the forest breathed around her sleeping form, Morgan's path forward clarified like a trail emerging from morning mist. Not an escape this time, but a purposeful journey towards something that mattered, something worth the risk of connection, something transformative. And somewhere in the surrounding wilderness, a remarkable pack of dogs continued their silent patrol, guardians of secrets that few humans would ever fully comprehend. But that one forest ranger had been privileged to witness. Their story would continue, intertwined now with Morgan's own. Separate paths that had crossed once in extraordinary circumstance and remained forever connected by the invisible bonds of shared purpose and mutual respect. Tomorrow would bring new beginnings, but the lessons of Blackridge Station, of Ajax, of the German shepherd, and its remarkable pack, those would remain, guiding lights for whatever challenges lay ahead. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.